Hi, my name's Rich Harris. I'm an engineer at Vercel and the creator of Svelte. I made this course so that you would have the definitive guide for learning how to use Svelte and SvelteKit to build apps of all shapes and sizes, from small demos all the way up to full stack production grade applications. In this SvelteKit course, you'll learn how to build full stack applications with server-side rendering, routing, environment variables, data fetching, and all of the other ingredients that go into making a successful performant full stack application. I hope you enjoy it. Just as layout.svelte files create UI for every child root, layout server.js files load data for every child root. So I suppose we'd like to add a more posts sidebar to our blog post page. We could return summaries from the load function here that powers the blog page in the same way that we're returning it from the page server.js that powers the index page, but that would be repetitive. Instead, what we're going to do is rename this file to layout server.js. And you'll notice that this page continues to work. It's still able to access the summaries data that's being returned from the layout function, the layout load function. And so now if we go to the individual post page, we have a layout already scaffolded out here. And we can add a sidebar inside here, just below the main element. Give it a title of more posts. And then we'll create an unordered list. And then we're going to iterate over data.summaries as slug title I'm just going to copy the code on the left into this component. And you can see that we're now able to render the summaries in the sidebar on the blog page as well as the blog index page. And what's neat about this is that as we navigate between these posts, we're not having to go back to the server and reload those summaries, because SvelteKit is aware that even though the post page has changed, the layout has not changed. And so we don't need to go and refetch that data. So in the chapter on loading data, we saw how you can export a load function from your page server.js and your layout server.js files. Well, we can also export page options from those files. We can export an SSR Boolean, a CSR Boolean, a pre-render value, and a trailing slash value. And these control how the page behaves. And in the following exercises, we're going to learn about each of these in turn. All of the page options that we're about to discuss can be exported from individual pages, or they can be applied to groups of pages by exporting them from a layout file. So if you want some behavior to apply to your entire application, you can put it in a root layout.js file. And then in child pages, you can enable or disable other aspects of that behavior as you need. This allows you to mix and match different behaviors in your application. For example, you can have an application that is mostly pre-rendered as static HTML, but has some dynamic pages that are rendered with personalized data, for example. And so this makes SvelteKit very versatile for whatever kind of application you're building. The first one we're going to learn about is SSR. So server-side rendering is the process of generating HTML on the server, and it's what SvelteKit does by default. It's very important for performance and resilience. It's very beneficial for search engine optimization, right? While some search engines cannot index content that is rendered in the browser with JavaScript, it happens less frequently and it happens less reliably. So SSR is a really important default to have. Having said that, there are some components that cannot be rendered on the server. Maybe they expect to be able to access browser globals like window immediately. And ideally, you would change those components so that they can be used on the server, but sometimes that's just not possible. So in some situations, you might need to disable server-side rendering. We can do that in a page server.js with export const SSR equals false. Right, and this will allow this page here to to be rendered without breaking the app, because if we were to server render this without SSR equals false, if you had the default SSR equals true, then we get an internal error when we try and server render this page, because window is not available on the server. This is a component that cannot be rendered in a server environment. The counterpart to SSR is CSR. Client-side rendering is what makes the page interactive. So here we have a button. When we click on it, it's going to increment the count. Right? It also enables SvelteKit to update the page upon navigation without causing a full page reload. And you can disable it using a page option. We'll add a page server.js file. I'm going to export const CSR equals false. Right? This means that no JavaScript is getting sent to the client at all. It also means that our components are no longer interactive. If I click on this button, nothing is going to happen. So most of the time, you're not going to use this option. You're not going to use this option, but it is a useful way to be able to find out how your app is going to behave for users who, for whatever reason, cannot use JavaScript. Someone just asked a really great question. Is the data cached, or are we fetching it anew each time? So we're keeping this stuff in memory as we're scrolling. And so if we scroll all the way down, we are fetching more data, we're fetching more data, we're fetching more data. But as we scroll back up, we're just rendering the data that we already have in memory. We're only going to start loading more data once we get to the end of the scroll window. And because we've already got all of this data, we're not going to get to the end of the scroll window until it is in fact time to load more data. But there is a really useful thing that we can do since we're controlling the data loading in a universal load function. And that is, we can add some client-side caching of our own. And that's useful because if you look at this front page here, we're already making a request to the trending API and the now playing API and the upcoming API endpoint. And it would be nice if we could just reuse that data when we navigate to these pages. So let's go into our API helper and we'll actually go ahead and implement that. So open libapi.ts. And inside this get function, we can create a cache. It's going to be a new map. Right, super naive. In a real app, you would have a little bit more of a sophisticated caching policy than just add everything to a cache map. But it's perfectly fine for this demo. So we're going to create a string, which is a URL. And that's going to be all of that data there. And then we're going to replace that with a reference to our URL. And now if we've cached this data already, then we're just going to return it directly from the cache. If cache.has URL, return cache.get URL. Otherwise, we'll make an API call by calling await fetch. We'll get the data, const data equals await response.json. And then we're going to add that to the cache. And for good measure, let's add some logging when we get a cache hit versus a cache miss. And we'll bring up the console. And so when we load this page, we've got a bunch of cache misses. But that's okay because we're using SvelteKit's built-in fetch. And what's actually happening here is the data is being fetched on the server, and then the response is being inlined into the HTML so that when we fetch it in the client during hydration, it's just grabbing the same data that was already fetched on the server. So we don't have a duplicate network request, and that allows us to guarantee consistency. Now, if we just clear that and navigate to the trending page, then hopefully, we got a cache miss. So disappointing. That's because we have a default page there. So let's get rid of the page equals 1 in the case where no page is necessary. Or alternatively, what we could do is in our root page load function, will just always default to page equals 1. So go to the root page.ts over here. And in each of these, we're just going to add page 1, like so. Right, and let's go to the home page and navigate to the trending page. All right, we've got a cache hit for the first page and a cache miss for the second page. And then we'll continue to get cache misses for the subsequent pages. But if we now navigate back to the home page, we're not going to be fetching any new data. We're getting all these lovely cache hits. So we're going to get instantaneous navigation. And this is something that you can only really do in a framework that has universal load functions, as opposed to making you go back to the server for everything. So obviously there is a time and a place for loading data from the server, but loading data directly from the client is really good, particularly for stuff that involves things like real time and so on. And so SvelteKit gives you both of those options for whatever you need when you're building your app.